There are places in every country that exist on the edge of the official world. Not hidden, exactly. Not secret. Just at the outer limit of where attention reaches. Where the road runs out, and the trees begin, and the nearest neighbor is far enough away that the sound of a door closing does not carry. Where mail arrives slowly, if it arrives at all. Where the connection to everything else is thin enough that it can be severed without immediately alerting anyone on the other end. The house at the end of the road was that kind of place. It sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off a county road that branched off a state highway, each branch narrower and less traveled than the one before it, the whole route requiring a deliberate decision to be on it, because it led nowhere else. There was no reason to drive that road, unless the house at the end of it was your destination. The nearest town was 7 miles west. Small, under 3,000 people, the kind of town where the grocery store and the gas station were combined, where everyone knew which car belonged to which family, where news traveled faster through conversation than through any publication. The kind of town where being known was unavoidable and being unknown was impossible. Unless you lived at the end of a dirt road that no one drove without a reason. A family of 4 lived in that house. They had lived there for 6 years before they disappeared. In 6 years, they had made a modest impression on the town. The adults purchased groceries every 2 weeks. They paid their property taxes on time. The 2 children, a boy and a girl, school age, attended the local elementary school, where they were described by their teachers as quiet, well-behaved, and somewhat withdrawn. Not troubled, not struggling, simply private. As if privacy were a habit so deeply embedded in how their family operated that even the children had absorbed it. The family attended no church. They participated in no local events. They had no close relationships with anyone in town that anyone would later be able to identify. They were known in the way that a piece of furniture in a room is known. Present, registered, part of the background, not thought about. This is the first thing to understand about this case. Not that the family was suspicious or unusual, that they were invisible, that the conditions of their invisibility were so thoroughly established, the road, the house, the quiet, the limited contact, that when they disappeared, the town did not notice immediately. And when the town did eventually notice, the response was not alarm. The response was silence. And the silence lasted 11 years. The last confirmed sighting of the family was on a Tuesday. A worker at the combined grocery and gas station saw the adult woman in the early afternoon. She came in for the family's regular 2-week purchase. Canned goods, fresh produce, bread, milk, the staple purchases of a household feeding 4. She paid in cash, as she always did. She said, as she always said when the cashier asked how things were out on the road, that things were fine. She loaded the bags into the back of their truck and drove away. The cashier watched the truck turn out of the parking lot and did not think anything of it. That was Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday morning, the truck was still parked outside the house at the end of the dirt road. The groceries from Tuesday's trip were partially unpacked in the kitchen, some items in the refrigerator, some still in bags on the counter. A pot was on the stove. The stove was off, but the pot contained food that had been prepared and not eaten. The table was set for 4. The family was not in the house. They were not in the yard. They were not anywhere on the property that a brief initial search could determine. This information was not reported to anyone for 11 days. The person who discovered the house on Wednesday morning was a man who occasionally did maintenance work on the property, a local handyman hired by the family twice a year for tasks they could not manage themselves. He had come that morning at the family's request to look at a problem with the water heater. He knocked on the door. No answer. He tried the door, unlocked. He went in. He saw the groceries on the counter and the pot on the stove and the table set for 4 and the family not there. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then he left. He did not call anyone. He did not file a report. He drove back to town and he went about his day, and when people asked him, over the following weeks, whether he knew anything about what had happened to the family at the end of the road, he said he did not. He said this for 11 years. We will come back to what he actually knew. In the days and weeks following the Tuesday when the family was last seen, a quiet understanding settled over the town. Not an agreement, nothing formal, nothing spoken openly. More like a collective decision made through the accumulation of individual decisions, each one small enough to be rationalized, each one contributing to an outcome that none of them, in isolation, could fully account for. People noticed a truck staying at the property. People noticed the absence of the family's regular Tuesday grocery run 2 weeks later. People who had seen the children at school noticed that the children were not at school. The school did not file a report. The administrator responsible for attendance noted the absences, attempted one phone call that was not answered, and recorded the family as having withdrawn, a classification that required no documentation, no verification, no confirmation from the family themselves. A notation in a ledger that effectively removed the children from the official record without anyone having spoken to anyone who could confirm that the children were safe. The church, the one the family did not attend, had a pastor who was, by all later accounts, a thoughtful and conscientious person. He heard, through the normal channels of small-town information movement, that the family at the end of the road appeared to have moved away. He noted this. He did not investigate it. He told himself that people moved, that not everyone announced their departure, that a family that had kept to themselves would naturally keep to themselves in leaving. He has said, in the years since, that this was the reasoning that allowed him to do nothing, that it was coherent reasoning, that it held together well enough to feel like a decision rather than an avoidance. He has also said, the reasoning was wrong. I knew something fell off. I chose the reasoning that allowed me to not act on it. That is not the same as having reasons. The hardware store owner saw the truck sitting on the property twice when he drove past. The dirt road was not on any route he normally took, and the fact that he drove past at all suggests a curiosity he never publicly admitted to. He saw the truck. He kept driving. He told himself the family was inside. The woman at the gas station saw the family's truck at the property when she drove past once, some weeks after the Tuesday. She stopped. She did not get out. She sat in her own car on the dirt road and looked at the house for several minutes. Then she drove away. She has said, I knew. I think most of us knew, in the way you know something when you're choosing not to examine it. I knew something was wrong, and I chose not to look directly at it, because looking directly at it would have required me to do something about it. And we all had reasons for not doing something about it. The reasons, it would later turn out, were not all the same. Some people did nothing out of fear. Fear of the people they believed were responsible. Fear of what knowing something might cost them. Some people did nothing out of something harder to categorize. A reluctance to disrupt. A comfort with the way things were. The specific moral failure of choosing ease over the obvious right thing. Some people did nothing because someone had told them not to. The town was not uniformly guilty of the same thing. It was guilty of many different things, all of which produced the same result. 11 years of silence while a family remained unaccounted for, and no one asked the question loudly enough to get an answer. He was not assigned to the case. This is important. At the time he began looking into it, there was no case. There was no file. There was no official record of a family at the end of a dirt road having disappeared, because no one had ever filed a report, and the various official channels that should have flagged the situation had either failed or been deliberately avoided. He was a detective who worked in the county seat, 30 miles from the town. He had spent 19 years in law enforcement, the last 9 as a detective. He was the kind of person who did not let things go easily. Not out of stubbornness, though he was also stubborn, but out of a deep conviction that unexplained things deserved explanation, and that the absence of a file did not mean the absence of a wrong. He first heard about the family at the end of the road from his wife's cousin, who lived in the town and who mentioned it in passing at a gathering, years after the family had disappeared. The cousin described the situation as something the town had largely moved past, a family that had lived on the edge of town for a few years, and then moved on. Nothing remarkable about it, except that they had left without really saying goodbye to anyone. He asked one question: was a report ever filed? The cousin did not know. He found out the following Monday. He called the county sheriff's office and asked about reports associated with the property. He called the state database and searched for any missing persons reports associated with the family's address. He called the elementary school district and asked about the 2 children's records. No report had ever been filed. The children's school records showed a withdrawal notation with no supporting documentation. The property had remained in the family's name for 3 years after their disappearance, accumulating back taxes, before it was eventually seized by the county for non-payment and sold at auction. Nobody had connected this to a missing family. It had been processed as a tax matter. He drove out to the town that Saturday. He drove to the end of the dirt road. The house was occupied by that point. Different owners, purchased at the county auction, and he did not approach it. He sat at the end of the road and looked at the house and thought about a family that had lived there and disappeared and that nobody had ever officially looked for. He opened a personal file that week. 3.5 years later, that personal file became the foundation of a formal investigation that resulted in 4 arrests, 3 convictions, and a reckoning that the town of under 3,000 people had been doing everything it could to avoid for over a decade. The first person he interviewed was the maintenance worker. He did not approach it as an interrogation. He found the man at his home on a Saturday morning, and he introduced himself honestly. He was a detective. He was looking into the disappearance of a family who had lived at the end of the road. He wondered if the man knew anything that might be helpful. The maintenance worker said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I can't talk to you about this." He asked why. The man said, "Because the people who did are still here. They live here. I see them at the hardware store and the gas station. They know I know. And they have made very clear, not in any way I could prove, not in any way I could put in writing, that talking about it would be a problem for me." He said, "I understand that. I'm asking you to talk to me anyway." The maintenance worker looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Come back in a week. I need to think." He came back in a week. The maintenance worker talked for 4 hours. What he had found on that Wednesday morning, when he went to the house to look at the water heater and found the groceries on the counter and the pot on the stove and the table set for 4, was not only an empty house. He had found, in the back room of the property, a room used for storage, off the main living area. Evidence of a struggle. Not extensive, not dramatic, in the way that crime scenes are often depicted. Small. A broken item on the floor. A mark on the wall consistent with impact. A substance on the floor near the back door that he had not been able to identify at the time, but that he had understood, instinctively and without wanting to, was blood. He had left. He had not called anyone. He had driven back to town, and he had gone to the house of the man he believed was responsible. He had been told that the family had been removed from the situation, that they had left, that this was all that needed to be said, that the alternative to accepting this explanation was a problem he would not want. He had accepted the explanation. For 11 years. He said, "There is no version of that I am proud of. I knew. I chose to not know. I let myself believe the explanation because the explanation was what I needed to hear. And the family, wherever they are, whatever happened to them, they deserved better than what I gave them, which was nothing." He said, "I'm telling you now. I understand that is not enough. I know it is not enough, but it is what I have." He told the detective the name of the man who had warned him. The man whose name the maintenance worker provided was not a prominent figure in the town. He was not the wealthiest person or the most powerful or the most visible. He ran a small contracting business. He had lived in the town his entire life. He was known in the way that people who have always been somewhere are known, thoroughly, as part of the landscape, his presence taken as a given by everyone around him. He had had a dispute with the family at the end of the road. The nature of a dispute was financial. The property sat adjacent to a piece of land that the contractor had been attempting to acquire for several years. Land with value for the contracting business. Land that the family's property blocked access to in a way that affected the use of the adjacent parcel. He had approached the family about purchasing the property or granting an easement. The family had declined. He had approached again. They had declined again. He had made a third approach, reportedly more pressured than the previous 2, and the family had made clear they were not interested and did not intend to become interested. After that third approach, there had been a period of escalation, incidents of the property that the family had not reported, because they were a family that did not involve official systems in their problems, that handled things internally, that had built their life at the end of a dirt road precisely because they valued distance from the world's attention. The family's resistance to official involvement was, in this case, the thing that cost them the most. Because the contractor understood the family's independence. He had studied it, in the way that a person studies an obstacle before deciding how to remove it. He knew they would not call for help. He knew that when they were gone, the town would accept a quiet explanation because the town, in various ways and for various reasons, was already oriented toward accepting things quietly. He had been right. For 11 years, he had been right. He had continued operating his contracting business. He had eventually acquired the land he wanted, not directly from the family's estate, but through the county tax sale that processed the abandoned property several years after the disappearance. He had paid auction price. It had been, by all external appearances, a routine transaction. The detective spent 6 months building the case before he presented it to the county prosecutor. The case was built on the following: the maintenance worker's testimony about what he had found in the house and what he had been told. Physical evidence recovered from the property, specifically from the back room and the back door area, that had survived 11 years in a house that had subsequently been sold and occupied by a family with no connection to the original case. The new owners, when approached by the detective with a warrant and an explanation, cooperated fully. The stains on the floor of the storage room had been painted over but not removed. Forensic analysis of the layers of paint recovered the original material beneath. Records of the contractor's attempts to acquire the property, documented in partial records from the county assessor's office, supplemented by bank records obtained under warrant that showed a pattern of financial pressure applied to the family in the period before their disappearance. The testimony of 3 other town residents who, once the investigation became official and the contractor's name was attached to it, came forward with information they had been holding for years. Not all of them had direct knowledge. 2 had peripheral information, things they had seen or heard that had not, at the time, seemed significant or that they had chosen not to act on. 1 had direct knowledge. She had been present at a conversation between the contractor and 2 associates 2 nights before the family disappeared, in which the situation had been discussed in terms she had understood immediately and that had frightened her into silence for 11 years. She said, when she finally came forward, "I have thought about those 2 children every single day for 11 years. Every day. I have imagined them and what happened and what I might have prevented. And I'm telling you now because I cannot carry it any further. Whatever happens to me for talking, whatever he does, it cannot be worse than another day of carrying this." She told the detective everything she had heard. It was enough. 4 people were arrested. The contractor, 2 associates who had been involved in the events of the night the family disappeared, and the maintenance worker, who had known and said nothing for 11 years and whose silence, the prosecutor argued, made him complicit in the sustained concealment of a crime. The maintenance worker's case was the most complex from a legal standpoint. He had committed no violence. He had taken no action against the family. What he had done was know and stay silent, which in the absence of a legal obligation to report, placed him in a gray area that required careful prosecution. The prosecutor argued that his active silence, his specific decision to not report after being warned by the contractor, combined with his participation in the concealment through his false statements over 11 years, constituted obstruction sufficient to charge. The defense argued that a person in fear for their safety, warned by someone they believe capable of violence, could not be held to the same standard as someone who had acted from indifference rather than fear. The jury spent 3 days with this question. They convicted him on a reduced charge. He accepted the verdict without apparent surprise. He had, by all accounts, been expecting something like it. He had cooperated fully with the investigation. He had told the truth. He had cried, once, during his testimony, a single moment, brief and quickly controlled, when he was asked to describe what he had seen in the storage room of the house on the Wednesday morning 11 years before. He had stopped speaking and looked at the table, and then he had looked at the prosecutor and he had said, "I see it every time I close my eyes. I have seen it every time I close my eyes for 11 years. I do not need to describe it for you, but I will." And he did. The contractor was convicted on 3 counts, the most serious of which carried a sentence of life without the possibility of release. He maintained throughout the trial that he had had no involvement in the disappearance of the family, and that the testimony against him was the product of old grudges and poor recollection. His manner throughout the proceedings was the manner of a man who had been confident for a very long time in his ability to control the information around him, and who was finding, in the specific experience of a courtroom, the limits of that control. When the verdict was read, he said nothing. He has not spoken publicly since. The 2 associates received sentences between 15 and 22 years. The family, the 4 of them, were found. Not alive, but found. The location was identified through information provided by one of the 2 associates during plea negotiations. Information given in exchange for the lower of the 2 sentences, and that the prosecutor later described as the most important single piece of information in the entire case. The family was found at a location approximately 4 miles from the house at the end of the road. A place deep enough in the surrounding land that an undirected search would not have reached it. A place that the contractor had known, had used professionally in his contracting work, in a way that meant he understood it in the specific way that a person understands a location they have used for a purpose. They had been there for 11 years. The town knew, finally, what it had been pretending not to know. The reckoning in the town was not clean. Reckonings never are. The satisfying version of a story like this is the one where the truth comes out and the community turns toward the light and the wrong is identified and acknowledged and the people responsible are held to account and the town moves forward with the specific clarity that comes from having faced the worst of itself. That happens. It happened here, partially. But it is never as clean as the satisfying version because human beings are not as clean as the satisfying version. Some people in the town were relieved. The weight of knowing, even the partial, willfully unexamined knowing that most of them had been carrying, had been a burden. Having it out, having it named, having it in a courtroom with a verdict attached, gave them something they had not had before. Some people in the town were angry, not at the right things. At the detective who had come from outside and stirred what had settled. At the maintenance worker for talking. At the woman who had come forward with what she had heard. There is always, in a small community, a category of person who experiences the exposure of a community's failure as an attack on the community rather than as a consequence of the failure itself. This category of person existed in this town. They were vocal in the early period. They became less vocal over time. Because the two children, the boy and the girl who had gone to the elementary school and been described as quiet and withdrawn, had names. They had been real. They had drawn pictures and asked questions and sat at a school desk and gone home each afternoon to a house at the end of a dirt road. The town had known them in the limited and distanced way that the family had permitted the town to know them. And the town had to live, after the verdict, with the knowledge of what it had allowed to happen to two children it had nominally known. That knowledge did not go away. The school changed its withdrawal procedures. The county changed its approach to properties accumulating back taxes without verified contact with the owners. The state implemented a review process for cases where multiple official channels had failed to flag a disappearance. The specific multi-system failure that had allowed the family to fall through every gap simultaneously. These are procedural changes. They are real and they matter. They are the kind of thing that happens when a case reveals not just the crime, but the conditions that allowed the crime to remain hidden. But the procedural changes are not the whole point. The whole point is the family. The whole point is four people who live at the end of a road and who deserve to be remembered as exactly what they were. A family. Not a case. Not a catalyst for policy change. Not a lesson. A family who bought groceries every 2 weeks and paid their taxes on time and had a boy and a girl who went to school and came home and sat down to a dinner that was still on the table when the detective who would not let it go finally came looking. The detective gave one interview after the verdicts were entered. It was a local interview for a county newspaper, and it lasted 40 minutes. He was asked about the case and about what had driven him to pursue it without an assignment and without official support for 3.5 years before the investigation became formal. He said, "Most cases, when you look into them, you find that the thing that went wrong was specific. A piece of evidence missed, a witness not interviewed, a connection not made. You can identify the failure point, and you can understand it in terms of the specific pressures and resources and information available at the time." He said, this case was different. The failure was not a specific missed thing. It was a collective choice, not one person's choice. Many people's choices, each one small, each one rationalized, each one contributing to an outcome that none of them, making their individual choice, would have said they were choosing. He said, that is the thing that stays with me, not the contractor. The contractor made a decision, and it was a terrible decision, and he is where he belongs. It is the other decisions. The cashier at the gas station who drove past the house and did not get out of her car. The pastor who heard the family had moved and chose the reasoning that allowed him not to investigate. The school that accepted a withdrawal with no documentation. He said, none of those people are in prison. None of them should be, necessarily. But each of them made a decision that added one more layer of silence over a family that was already gone. He said, I think about that. About how many layers of individual decisions it takes to bury something for 11 years. And the answer is Not that many. Not a conspiracy. Just a series of ordinary people choosing, one at a time, the path that required the least from them. He was asked whether he was angry at the town. He said, "Anger is not really what I feel. It is something more like grief. Grief that things work the way they work. That good people, and some of those people were good people who made a bad choice under bad circumstances, can collectively produce an outcome as complete as this one." He was asked what he wanted people to take from the case. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Ask the question. Whatever the question is that you are choosing not to ask because asking it will require something of you. Ask it anyway. Make the call you are hesitating to make. File the report you are telling yourself is probably unnecessary." He said, the family at the end of that road needed someone to ask one question earlier. They needed someone to not rationalize their way out of making a call. They needed one person to choose the action that cost something over the inaction that cost nothing. He said, "We owe them that. We owe them being the kind of people who ask the question." He said, "We owe that to everyone like them." The house at the end of the dirt road still stands. It belongs to new owners now. The family who purchased it at the county auction and who have lived in it for years and who know its history and who have chosen to remain there, which is a decision that deserves acknowledgement. They planted a garden in the back. They painted the shutters. They have made it, in every way a house can be made into a home, a home. The storage room where the maintenance worker found what he found has been renovated completely. New floor, new walls. The new owners know what happened in that room. They have spoken publicly about their decision to stay. They said they felt that someone should be in the house who knew what it had been and who could hold that knowledge consciously rather than let the house sit empty and allow the silence to continue in a different form. The road at the end of which the house sits is still a dirt road, still narrow, still a deliberate destination rather than a route to anything else. The county has discussed paving it 3 times. Each time, the expense has been deemed unnecessary for a road with so few residents. It remains a road you only drive if the house at the end of it is where you are going. The detective retired 2 years after the verdicts. He moved to a different county. He has given no further interviews. He tends a garden and walks his dog and has, by all accounts, found a version of quiet that is different in character from the quiet that surrounded the case for 11 years. The woman who came forward, the one who had heard the conversation 2 nights before the family disappeared, received no legal consequences. She had not been part of the planning. She had been a witness to information and had failed, for 11 years, to act on it. The prosecutor had the discretion to charge her and chose not to, citing her cooperation in the context of her fear. She has remained in the town. This surprised some people. She has said, "I stayed because leaving would have felt like another form of running away. I was already a person who ran away from a thing when I should have stood up. I was not going to do it again." The maintenance worker served his sentence. He was released after 2 years, having cooperated fully and behaved without incident. He moved to a different state. His whereabouts are not public. The contractor is in a facility in the northern part of the state. He will remain there. His contracting business, what remained of it after the trial, was dissolved. The land he had wanted so badly, the land adjacent to the property at the end of the road, the land for which 4 people had died, was acquired by the county after his conviction and has been designated as a small public park. It sits at the edge of town, between the cleared land and the tree line, and people walk their dogs there in the evenings. Most of them do not know the history of the land they are walking on. Some of them do. The case of the family at the end of the road is not famous. It did not become a national story. It did not generate the kind of media attention that some cases generate, where the coverage becomes its own event, where the public interest becomes so large that it changes the shape of the case itself. It was a county case, a small town, a family that had kept to themselves in life, and whose disappearance had been absorbed into the silence that they had cultivated around themselves for 6 years. What makes it worth telling? What makes it a case that people in law enforcement and criminal justice circles return to when discussing what evidence review and community silence and individual moral choice can produce? Is its precision. It is a case about what happens when all the small decisions go the wrong way. When the cashier drives past and keeps driving. When the school accepts the withdrawal without documentation. When the pastor chooses the reasoning that requires less of him. When the maintenance worker accepts the explanation because the alternative is frightening. None of those decisions is monstrous in isolation. Each one is the kind of decision that ordinary people make when they are faced with something they do not want to deal with and are given a reasonable sounding reason not to deal with it. And the sum of all those ordinary, non-monstrous decisions was 11 years of silence over 4 people who had done nothing wrong. That is what this case is about. Not the contractor. The contractor was the ignition point. What kept the fire invisible for 11 years was not him. It was all the small choices made by ordinary people in a small town at the edge of a county that had a family living at the end of a road that nobody drove unless they had a reason to. Ask the question. Make the call. File the report. Choose the thing that costs something over the thing that costs nothing. Because somewhere, right now, there's a family at the end of a road. And the only thing standing between them and 11 years of silence is one person deciding to ask,